Staying in Alberta tonight, the Premier of that province has launched an ad campaign aimed at convincing the federal government to back down from its plan to achieve 100% emissions-free electricity in Canada by 2035. Premier Danielle Smith is with us live now from Calgary to talk about that. Hi, Premier. Good to have you with us. Thank you very much for making the time.
You bet. Thanks, Vashi.
Just before we get into the pushback against the federal government and the regulations, I just wanted to ask you, as Premier of the province, do you feel that the university made the right decision in returning that donation?
I do, and I was pleased to see that the Speaker took responsibility and stepped down, and that the Prime Minister issued an apology. I share the comments of the Governor General. It was humiliating and embarrassing for all Canadians, and hopefully we can start to make some amends.
Speaking of making amends, there is a monument in Edmonton that is partly recognizing the unit that this individual, Yaroslav Hunka, belonged to, the 1st Ukrainian unit. There are some renewed calls now, in light of what's unfolded, to do something about that statue, perhaps even, or that monument, perhaps even take it down. Do you support those calls?
I think there are 2 monuments in Edmonton, and they're both put up by private organizations. I would hope that they would watch what has been discussed over the last number of days and just reflect on what message that's sending, not only to Albertans and Canadians, but to the Jewish community, and do the right thing.
Okay, moving on, Premier, to the launch of those ads today and your pushback against the federal government. I know you said, and this is specific, I should say, to electricity and net zero emissions from the electricity grid by 2035. You said today that you're preparing kind of a draft of a motion to utilize the Sovereignty Act. You don't want to do it, but you're preparing for the possibility that you might have to. Given the fact that the Supreme Court has already ruled on the federal power to regulate emissions in the case of carbon pricing, can you understand how some people watching you make those comments and watching you talk about the thought of introducing the Sovereignty Act, or using the Sovereignty Act rather, would see or would think that it amounts to political posturing?
Well, it's not political posturing. I have talked to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau from the very first conversation we had, where I told him that we were aligned with his aspiration to be net zero by 2050. I told him that we would be coming up with our own emissions reduction and energy development plan. I told him that we'd be wanting to put tables together so we could work together on figuring out what some of those interim measures were. We've started a table. We're having those negotiations. But I also told him very clearly that we cannot have unilateral action by the federal government, whether it's on clean electricity regs or emissions caps on oil and gas, or emissions caps on fertilizer, for that matter, or aggressive methane reduction targets that don't recognize that we own our resources. We have the right under the Constitution to develop them. We have the right to conserve them, and we have the right to run our own electricity power grid. So I'm still hopeful that we'll be able to come to some solution, because I think, as I said, we're in sync on the end objective. We're just arguing about the pace with which we can get there.
Is it a binary option, kind of 2035 or bust? And I ask because everything I've read from the comments from the federal government so far are that they really do want to meet that timeline, but that they are willing to put a lot on the table to help Alberta achieve it. So why not work with them to get there sooner, instead of just throwing out the timeline completely?
Well, we've looked at a number of different projections about how much that would cost. At the upper end, $1.7 trillion for the entire economy. For Alberta, somewhere between $200 billion and $400 billion within 12 years. That would increase the cost of our electricity 4 or 5-fold. And so there just isn't that amount of money available to reach this aggressive a target. And the technology, quite frankly, isn't available yet. I've talked to the Prime Minister about how we're going to get to net zero. And there are a number of companies who are already talking about it. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage, rolling out small modular nuclear, doing interties with our neighbors in British Columbia and Manitoba, and bringing in clean hydro, as well as seeing if there's a way for us to be able to use more hydrogen. But all of those technologies are really in their infancy, and it takes time to develop them. The idea that we could develop this complete revolution in our power grid within 12 years is just not achievable. And so I'm trying to get the federal government to orient around the same target as we are, which is 2050.
From what I listened to today, it sounds like you're basing those, for example, cost estimations or the improbability or impossibility, as you view it, of the timeline on analysis done by the operator of the power grid, AESO, I think is the acronym for it. But AESO today, in presenting those conclusions, presented none of the data or analysis that led them to it. Why should Canadians or Albertans trust that if it's not transparent?
Well, there are a couple of studies that we've released, and I'm happy to release more. One of the studies was done by the Public Policy Forum. They're the ones who came up with the $1.7 trillion figure. We know that there's a certain amount of capital turnover that happens, and so under normal circumstances, $92 billion would be what we would expect to spend to be able to build out our power grid by 2050. The ISO said that it would be another $52 billion to try to get to net zero. So you're trying to cram that amount of spending into 12 years. So I would say that the real problem that we have is that the federal government picked a target out of thin air with no idea about how it would impact a province like ours, or Saskatchewan, or Nova Scotia, or New Brunswick, all which have significant amounts of hydroelectric or hydrocarbon power on their grids. And it's up to us to educate them, and it's up to them to respond to something that's realistic and practical. And they haven't done so yet. And so we just have to be very frank about what this will mean. What it will mean is unaffordable electricity. They've also put a chill on investment in natural gas plants because of their unrealistic and punitive targets. And that's affecting our ability to attract baseload. So we're already beginning to see some disruption in our power grid. We've had 10 near failures since 2022, and we've got to start working on bringing more baseload onto the grid. That's going to be urgent to ensure reliability.
What about your government's own culpability, though, in the kinds of rates that Albertans already pay? I know you're warning about what might happen in the future, but Albertans right now, for example, in July, were paying 127% more for electricity than they were the July before. I know you've blamed it on a move away from coal, but I read some independent analysis, for example, that pointed to a lack of regulation and increased market concentration following the end of power purchase agreements. Plus, you've put a pause on adding renewable generation and renewable development to the grid. What's your own culpability in all this? Why is it all the federal government's fault?
Well, the NDP in our province totally wrecked our power grid. There's no question about that. They phased out coal too early. We're still paying for it, $100 million per year until 2030 because of those stranded assets. And we had a market that was based on having base load from coal providing 70% or more of our power. So now we've created an environment where wind and solar are intermittent, and we have to have a natural gas backup to make sure that when the wind isn't blowing, the sun isn't shining, that we do have reliability. And that's what's caused some of the disruptions. So I would say that the problem that we have in Alberta is that because solar and wind are intermittent, every megawatt of new power we bring on from those renewable sources, we have to be able to bring on a natural gas backup. Because when it's minus 30 or plus 30, you have to be able to turn on your furnace and you have to be able to turn on your air conditioning. Otherwise, people die. And we have to take that seriously. So you cannot just keep on building out a power grid with solar and wind, because it's just not reliable enough for us to be able to ensure that we can have not only the affordability, but also make sure that we don't end up with rolling blackouts. And that's the real problem, is that until we can make sure that we have new baseload coming on, we had to put a pause on wind and solar to figure out how these two systems are going to mesh.
I certainly take your point on that, but you didn't address the substance of, I know you're saying it's all the NDP's fault, but all the analysis I've read outside of your parties shows that a lack of regulation and the end of those power purchase agreements certainly contributed to a market concentration that allowed for greater profits from the power suppliers, basically, and the power operators. That happened when your government was in power, when the UCP was in power. Does some of the blame for the high rates Albertans pay, much of it actually, not lie at your party and your government's feet versus just throwing it all at the feds?
Well, look, it was a previous administration. As you can see, I've been in power less than a year as Premier, and I've made this my #1 priority. I've been studying the electricity markets since the late 1990s when we deregulated, and some mistakes have been made all along the way through multiple different governments. And I didn't create the problems, I'm just here to fix them. And the way we fix them is we make sure that we bring on baseload power, we make sure that we have responsible solar and wind so that we ensure that, it does have backup in the event that we have intermittency, and that we have a pathway to make sure that we get to emissions neutrality, but in a way that doesn't end up creating a hardship for our most vulnerable citizens. We have to be mindful that energy poverty is a real problem, and we have to do these kinds of actions to make and still make sure that we have that reliability and affordability.
Premier Smith, I'm out of time. I appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
You bet, my pleasure.